Hello everyone, welcome to this paper discussion. My name is Lisa Reinke and in the following 15 minutes I will introduce you to the paper Failure in Automotive Headlight Lenses, explain the analysis methods and, in the end, get into the discussion about the paper's quality. Before we start with the experimental methods, I will shortly put a spotlight onto polycarbonate, for short PC. Polycarbonate is an engineering thermoplastic. It is often used as a functional material when it comes to automotives because it has rather high thermal stability, high hardness and strength, and also very good optical properties, which is decisive for lens material. Compared to glass, which is another classic material for headlight lenses, it has some very attractive advantages. It can be used to reduce weight, it is not as expensive as glass, it has a higher freedom in design and also provides greater safety because it doesn't scatter when braking. But besides all those good reasons to use PC in headlights, it also comes with some risks. As in all functional polymeric parts, the processing can influence the part's properties if produced under critical conditions. The problematic aspects of using PC as headlight material can be divided into two parts: intrinsic and extrinsic stresses. PC headlights are produced by injection molding, so injection residual stresses might be present in the finished part. They can originate, for example, from thermal gradients, as non-uniform cooling, or can be caused by mechanical molding forces acting on the flow as it is sheared during the injection. Because of the shear stresses and flow parameters, the polymer chains in the melt experience molecular orientation and even are stretched, which causes stress. If this stress is not relieved during the solidification, it can affect the part's performance negatively during its lifetime. This means the residual stresses can cause warping and even fractures when the localized stress relieves uncontrolled. Also, extrinsic stress, or environmental stress factors, can be introduced to the part. For example, when the headlight is attached to other parts of the vehicle, if a screw is tightened too heavily, or if the finished part has to encounter critical environmental conditions, such as chemicals or great temperature differences. Also, the material sooner or later will suffer from creep, which can be described as the deformation under constant load or continuous stress on a large timescale. It is a process of stress relief which results in disentanglement of the polymer chains, viscoelastic deformation, crazing, and in the end fracture. Knowing these properties, we now have covered the theoretical basics to be able to get to the main part of my presentation. The paper was written by Mônica Martiniano Ferreira and Vanessa de Freitas Cunha Lins. It was published in October 2019 in the peer-reviewed journal Engineering Failure Analysis. The aim of the authors was to identify the reasons of failure in headlight lens samples, to clarify if they originate from processing, environmental, or working conditions. The main hypothesis is that most of the headlight failures originate from external stresses caused by the environmental media. The experiments were carried out with 4 headlight lens samples, 1 new headlight and 3 cracked lenses, which all failed during normal use at different millages. As the case study was performed in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, average temperature, humidity and radiation were given by the weather conditions at this location. In total, 5 different analysis methods were used to identify the samples and the origins of failure. As DSC, differential scanning calorimetry, and VCAT analysis were performed only in order to verify the material of the samples, I will focus on ATR-IFTR, ESC, and ZEM. Here you can see a schematic cross-section of the lens. The external surface is covered with a protective acrylate coating, and therefore all the experiments were carried out both at the outside and the inner side of the lens. The ATR-IFTR is a modification of standard infrared spectroscopy. The abbreviation stands for Attenuated Total Reflection Infrared Fourier Transformation Spectroscopy. This form is often used for samples in rigid forms, such as powders with limited solubility, coatings, adhesives, or filaments. Here you can see a schematic setup of an ATR-IFTR. The sample is mounted on top of and below a crystalline material with a very high refractive index. With the right angle adjustments, an entering ray of monochromated light will be reflected totally across the sample width before it gets to the detector. At each side where the ray hits the sample material, absorption takes place corresponding to the absorption bands of the material. This enables characterization. The resulting spectra look very similar to the standard IR spectra. The authors of the paper used this technique to analyze chemical changes of the polycarbonate lenses, such as degradation and changes in structure. You can see the chemical structure of PC here. It has benzene rings and 4 functional groups: C double bond O, CO, CH, and a CC bond. These functional groups can later be identified in the spectra as peaks at certain wave numbers. For the degeneration analysis, the sample number 1, which is the totally new headlight, and sample number 4, the headlight which had the highest millage, have been compared. The resulting spectrum shows that at the internal surface of the lenses, no major difference could be found in the spectra. There was no evidence for degradation of the PC at the inner side of the lens. For the outer region, the spectra indeed show significant changes. In this diagram, you can see the chemical degradation of the acrylate coating of the outer lens surface. There are many spectrum features which indicate this degradation, but let me just explain two. Take a look at the fingerprint region, which is at wave numbers from 1400 to 100 centimeters to the power of -1, here marked in orange. The bands of sample 4 show much lower intensity than those of the new headlight sample 1. This can be attributed to the loss of low molecular weight material caused by degradation. Another interesting part of the spectrum is located around wave number 1650. This band increases. It's attributed to a CC double bond. During degradation, chain scission occurs, which leads to terminal unsaturation. So this band increases with increasing fragmentation of the polymer chains. Conclusively, the photodegradation of the outer lens surface can be assumed. The cracks of the samples were deeper analyzed using scanning electron microscopy. The main goal was eliminating failures because of impact damages. In this picture, you can see the cracks on the lens surface of sample 2, which broke at a millage of 4,485 kilometers. It can be seen that the polycarbonate around the cracks doesn't appear to be damaged. The authors identified the initiation location, which you can see in picture A, and then analyzed the smaller cracks branching off of the primary crack. The initiation site corresponds with the location of the maximum principal tensile stress concentration. No plastic deformation or material irregularities were observed in the cracked area. Environmental stress cracking is the phenomenon of cracking caused by external stresses, such as aggressive chemical media or mechanical loads. It can be simulated under laboratory conditions to examine the residual stresses in a part. Therefore, the part is chemically attacked by immersion in an aggressive medium. After immersion, the samples are visually checked for cracks or failures in the surface. This test was performed with 3 completely new headlight samples to reduce the results exclusively to the residual stresses in headlight lenses introduced during production. One of the 3 samples showed cracks after immersion. The authors therefore found their assumption of residual stresses from production processes to be approved. The SEM images you can see here show the location of the cracks and their appearance. Again, no plastic deformation can be seen and the material doesn't show any irregularities. But in contrast to the previous samples, the cracks here show at the inner side of the lens. This was to be expected because the outer side of the lens is covered with an acrylate coating. This protective layer prevents the aggressive medium to attack the polycarbonate and therefore blocks any relief of residual stresses at this site. The authors concluded 3 main failure mechanisms. Relaxation of the molecular segments of polycarbonate at first. The authors assume that different mechanical processes cause this failure. Secondly, residual stresses, which are not properly relieved during assembly and attachment of the lens in the vehicle. And thirdly, degradation of the protective acrylic coating and consequently of the polycarbonate itself, which assumingly is induced by sunlight and cleaning solutions. Now turn the spotlight onto the discussion. For the review of the paper, I defined 3 main criteria: quality of information, setup, and reputation. The quality of information can be analyzed when looking at the accuracy first. The analysis methods are described briefly, but with all information needed to understand the setup of the experiments. Another important factor of quality is the citation style. The paper indicates citations very clearly. The references for literature values can be accessed easily. I didn't check all the citations, but the ones I did were matching the statements in the paper. although it has to be said that the authors don't cite original sources exclusively. The third aspect I chose was the peer review. The paper was published in the journal Engineering Failure Analysis, which is a peer-reviewed paper. It was received in December 2018 and revised in June 2019. As it passed the peer review, this criteria is fulfilled. I scored the setup of the paper at first by analyzing the structure. The two most important parts of a paper are abstract and conclusion. The abstract contains information on the aim of the paper, the analysis methods, and the currency of the problem itself. The paper fulfills the important aspects of a good abstract. The conclusion summarizes the most important results and ends with a statement that the results match and corroborate the main hypothesis. In this case, that failure in PC headlight lenses originates mostly from residual stresses. It provides the reader with all the main information and some interpretation, which is crucial for a conclusion. One major weak point, however, is the missing of an outlook. The authors don't share ideas of how the results can be useful for designing and manufacturing new headlight lenses in the future. This is not a must for a good paper, but it sure is a criteria for the relevance of the information. If there is no indication on how the results can be applied in the future or how other scientists can continue the research on the topic, the impact of the research might not be very high. Another important criteria for the quality of the paper setup is the usage of pictures, images, and graphs to describe the samples, experiments, and results. The very first image of the paper, which you can see here again, shows the 4 samples. As you can see, the angle of the photographs is different for every sample. It is not very easy or even impossible to really compare the cracks to each other because the position, lighting, and magnification is not the same for every sample. For the reader, it is therefore hard to have an overview and understanding of the samples. The third review category is the reputation of the paper. Does it have a high currency? I would say yes. Many automobile manufacturers use polycarbonate instead of glass lenses. The interest of industry in improving the performance of such material alternatives, therefore, is rather high. Secondly, is the paper discussed in the scientific society? No, and this is in my opinion the most relevant weak point. The paper is not cited very often, at least nobody states it online. This might be caused by the low relevance of the paper. The sample quantity is rather low, only 4 headlights were analyzed. This is not a statistically relevant amount. Furthermore, the conditions of sampling are not very accurate. The only conditions stated are average values for humidity, temperature, radiation, and the mileage of the vehicles until failure of the headlight. The routes, driving conditions, speed, etc. are not measured. In the conclusion, however, the authors describe possible failure mechanisms such as shaking, twisting, and weather conditions, but they did not analyze it to prove their assumptions. Conclusively, it can be said that the paper has a good potential to be the foundation for further research. It provides an overview on the failure modes and some first interpretation ideas. For a relevant case study, the sample size has to be improved, and the relevance of the data and results has to be more emphasized. That to be said, I reached the end of my presentation. Now I'm eager to get into discussion on what you might think are the strong and weak points of the paper. Do you agree with my criteria, or do you think there are some missing points in my review?